Chapter 24 of History of the World War by Francis March and Richard Beamish. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Marianne. Chapter 24 The Campaign in Mesopotamia. In our previous discussion of the British campaign in Mesopotamia, we left the British forces entrenched at Kurna and also occupying Basra, the port of Baghdad. The object of the Mesopotamia expedition was primarily to keep the enemy from the shores of the Gulf of Persia. If the English had been satisfied with that, the misfortune which was to come to them might never have occurred, but the whole expedition was essentially political rather than military in its nature. The British were defending India. The Germans, unable to attack the British Empire by sea, were hoping to attack her by land. They had already attempted to stir up a holy war with the full expectation that it would lead to an Indian revolution. In this they had failed, for the millions of Mohammedans in India cared little for the Turkish Sultan or his proclamations. Through Baghdad, however, they hoped to strike a blow at the English influence on the Persian Gulf. The English, therefore, felt strongly that it was not enough to sit safely astride the Tigris, but that a blow at Baghdad would produce a tremendous political effect. It would practically prevent German communication with Persia and the Indian frontier. As a matter of fact, the Persian Gulf and the oil fields were safe so long as the English held Kurna and Basra, and the Arabs were of no special consequence. The real reason for the expedition was probably that about this time matters were moving badly for the Allies. Serbia was in trouble in the Balkans. Gallipoli was a failure. Something it seemed ought to be done to restore the British prestige. Up to this time the Mesopotamia expedition had been a great success, but it had made no great impression on the world. The little villages in the hands of the British had unknown names. But if Baghdad should be captured, Great Britain would have something to boast of. Something would keep up its prestige among its Mohammedan subjects. But before the expedition to Baghdad was determined on, there had been several lively fights between the English forces and the Turks. On March 3rd, a Turkish force numbering about 12,000 appeared at Ahwaz, where the British had placed a small garrison to protect the pipeline of the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. The British retirement led to heavy fighting, with severe losses. A number of lively skirmishes followed, and then the serious attack against Shiaba. The Turkish army numbered about 18,000 men, of whom 11,000 were regulars. The fighting lasted for several days, the Turks being reinforced. On the 14th of April, however, the English attacked in turn and put the whole enemy force to flight. The British lost about 700 officers and men, reported a Turkish loss of about 6,000. In their retreat, the Turks were attacked by their Arab allies and suffered additional losses. From that time till the summer there were no serious contests, although there were occasional skirmishes which turned out favorably to the British. By this time the Turks had collected a considerable army north of Kurna, and on May 31st an expedition was made to disperse it. On June 3rd the British captured Amara, 75 miles above Kurna, scattering the Turkish army. Early in July a similar expedition was sent against Nisiriya, which led to serious fighting, the Turks being badly defeated with a loss of over 2,500 men. Kut el Amara still remained, and early in August an expedition was directed against that point. The Turks were found in great force, well entrenched, and directed by German officers. The battle lasted for 4 days. The English suffered great hardship on account of the scarcity of water and the blinding heat, but on September 29th they drove the enemy from the city and took possession. More than 2,000 prisoners were taken. The town was found thoroughly fortified, with an elaborate system of trenches extending for miles, built in the true German fashion. Its capture was the end of the summer campaign. Britain now had at last made up their minds to push on to Baghdad. General Townshend, whose work so far had been admirable, protested, but Sir John Nixon and the Indian military authorities were strongly in favor of the expedition. By October, Turkey was able to gather a large army. She was fighting in Transcaucasia, Egypt, Gallipoli, and Mesopotamia. Little was going on in the first of these fronts, and she was able therefore to send to Mesopotamia almost 250,000 men. To meet these, General Townshend had barely 15,000 men, of whom only 1/3 were white soldiers. He was backed by a flotilla of boats of almost every kind, river boats, motor launches, paddle steamers, native punts. The British army was almost worn out by the fighting during the intense heat of the previous summer, but their success had given them confidence. In the early days of October the advance began. For some days it proceeded with no serious fighting. On the 23rd of October it reached Azizi and was halted by a Turkish force numbering about 4,000. These were soon routed, and the advance continued until General Townsend arrived at Laj, about 7 miles from Ctesiphon, where the Turks were found heavily entrenched and in great numbers. Ctesiphon was a famous old city which had been the battleground of Romans and Parthians, but was now mainly ruins. In these ruins, however, the Turks found admirable shelter for nests of machine guns. On the 21st of November, General Townsend made his attack. The Turks occupied 2 lines of entrenchments and had about 20,000 men, the English about 12,000. General Townsend's plan was to divide his army into 3 columns. The first was to attack the center of the first Turkish position. A second was directed at the left of that position, and a third was to swing widely round and come in on the rear of the Turkish force. This plan was entirely successful, but the Turkish army was not routed, and retreated fighting desperately to its second line. There it was reinforced and counterattacked with such vigor that it drove the British back to its old first trenches. The next day the Turks were further reinforced and attacked again. The British drove them back over and over, but found themselves unable to advance. The Turks had lost enormously, but the British had lost about 1/3 of their strength and were compelled to fall back. They therefore returned on the 26th to Laj, and ultimately, after continual rearguard attacks, to Kut. There they found themselves surrounded, and there was nothing to do but wait for help. By this time the eyes of the world were upon the beleaguered British army. Help was being hurried to them from India, but Germany was also awake, and Marshal von der Goltz, who had been military instructor in the Turkish army, was sent down to take command of the Turkish forces. The town of Kut lies in the loop of the Tigris, making it almost an island. There was an entrenched line across the neck of land on the north, and the place could resist any ordinary assault. The great difficulty was one of supplies. However, as the relieving force was on the way, no great anxiety was felt. For some days there was a constant bombardment, which did no great damage. On the 23rd an attempt was made to carry the place by assault, but this too failed. The relieving force, however, was having its troubles. These were the days of floods, and progress was slow and at times almost impossible. Moreover, the Turks were constantly resisting. The relief expedition was composed of 30,000 Indian troops, 2 Anglo-Indian divisions, and the remnants of Townsend's expedition, a total of about 90,000 men. General Sir Percy Lake was in command of the entire force. The march began on January 6th. By January 8th the British had reached Sheikh Saad, where the Turks were defeated in 2 pitched battles. On January 22nd he arrived at el Henna, where the Turks had entrenched themselves. After artillery bombardment the Turkish positions were attacked, but heavy rains had converted the ground into a sea of mud, rendering rapid movement impossible. The enemy's fire was heavy and effective, inflicting severe losses, and though every effort was made, the assault failed. For weeks the British troops bivouacked in driving rain on soaked and sodden ground. 3 times they were called upon to advance over a perfectly flat country, deep in mud and absolutely devoid of cover against well-constructed and well-planned trenches, manned by a brave and stubborn enemy, approximately their equal in numbers. They showed a spirit of endurance and self-sacrifice of which their country may be proud. But the repulse at Henna did not discourage the British army. It was decided to move up the left bank of the Tigris and attack the Turkish position at the Djoujiala redoubt. This meant a night march across the desert with great danger that there would be no water supply, and that, unless the enemy was routed, the army would be in great danger. General Lake says, on the afternoon of May 7th, General Almer assembled his subordinate commanders and gave his final instructions, laying particular stress on the fact that the operation was designed to effect a surprise, and that to prevent the enemy forestalling us, it was essential that the first phase of the operation should be pushed through with the utmost vigor. His dispositions were, briefly, as follows. The greater part of a division, under General Younghusband, assisted by naval gunboats, controlled the enemy on the left bank. The remaining troops were formed into 2 columns, under General Kemball and General Keary, respectively, a reserve of infantry and the cavalry brigade being held at the corps commander's own disposal. Kemball's column, covered on the outer flank by the cavalry brigade, was to make a turning movement to attack the Djoujiala redoubt from the south, supported by the remainder of the force, operating from a position to the east of the redoubt. The night march by this large force, which led across the enemy's front to a position on his right flank, was a difficult operation, entailing movement over unknown ground and requiring most careful arrangement to attain success. Thanks to excellent staff work and a good march discipline, the troops reached their allotted positions apparently undiscovered by the enemy. But while Keary's column was in position at daybreak, ready to support Kemball's attack, the latter's column did not reach the point selected for its deployment in the Dujailah Depression until more than an hour later. This delay was highly prejudicial to the success of the operation. When, nearly 3 hours later, Kemball's troops advanced to the attack, they were strongly opposed by the enemy from trenches cleverly concealed in the brushwood, and were unable to make further ground for some time, though assisted by Keary's attack upon the redoubt from the east. The southern attack was now reinforced and by 1 p.m. had pushed forward to within 500 yards of the redoubt, but concealed trenches again stopped further progress, and the Turks made several counterattacks with reinforcements which had by now arrived from the direction of Magassis. It was about this time that the corps commanders received from his engineer officers the unwelcome news that the water supply contained in rainwater pools and in Dujailah Depression, upon which he had reckoned, was insufficient and could not be increased by digging. It was clear, therefore, that unless the Dujailah redoubt could be carried that day, the scarcity of water would, of itself, compel the troops to fall back. Preparations were accordingly made for a further assault on the redoubt, and attacks were launched from the south and east under cover of a heavy bombardment. The attacking forces succeeded in gaining a foothold in the redoubt, but they were heavily counterattacked by large enemy reinforcements, and being subjected to an extremely rapid and accurate shrapnel fire from concealed guns in the vicinity of Sin after, they were forced to fall back to the positions from which they started. The troops who had been under arms for some 30 hours, including a long night march, were now much exhausted, and General Almer considered that a renewal of the assault during the night could not be made with any prospect of success. Next morning the enemy's position was found to be unchanged, and General Almer, finding himself faced with the deficiency of order already referred to, decided upon the immediate withdrawal of his troops to Wadi, which was reached the same night. For the next month the English were held in their positions by the Tigris floods. On April 4th the floods had sufficiently receded to permit another attack upon el Hana, which this time was successful. On April 8th the Turkish position at Sana-i-Yat was attacked, but the British were repulsed. Then they determined to make another attempt to capture the Sin after redoubt. On April 17th, the fort at Beit Aissa, 4 miles from Es Sin on the left bank, was captured after heavy bombardment and held against serious counterattacks. On the 20th and 21st, the Suna-i-Yat position was bombarded and vigorous assault was made, which met with some success. The Turks, however, delivered a strong counterattack and succeeded in forcing the British troops back. General Lake says, persistent and repeated attempts on both banks have thus failed, and it was known that at the outside not more than 6 days' supplies remained to the Kut garrison. The British troops were nearly worn out. The same troops had advanced time and again to assault positions strung by art and held by a determined enemy. For 18 consecutive days they had done all that men could do to overcome not only the enemy, but also exceptional climatic and physical obstacles, and this on a scale of rations which was far from being sufficient in view of the exertions they had undergone, but which the shortage of river transports had made it impossible to augment. The need for rest was imperative. On April 28th the British garrison at Kut el Amara surrendered unconditionally after a heroic resistance of 143 days. According to British figures, the surrendered army was composed of 2,970 English and 6,000 Indian troops. The Turkish figures are 13,300. The Turks also captured a large amount of booty, although General Townsend destroyed most of his guns and munitions. During the period in which Kut el Amara was besieged by the Turks, the British troops had suffered much. The enemy bombarded the town almost every day, but did little damage. The real foe was starvation. At first the British were confident that a relief expedition would soon reach them, and they amused themselves by cricket and hockey and fishing in the river. By early February, however, it was found necessary to reduce the rations, and a month later they were suffering from hunger. Some little help was given them by airplanes, which brought tobacco and some small quantities of supplies. Soon the horses and mules were slaughtered and eaten. As time went on the situation grew desperate. Till almost the end, however, they did not lose hope. Through the wireless they were informed about the progress of the relief expeditions, and had even heard their guns in the distance. They gradually grew, however, weaker and weaker, so that on the surrender the troops in the first lines were too weak to march back with their kits. The Turks treated the prisoners in a chivalric manner. Food and tobacco was at once distributed, and all were interned at Anatolia, except General Townshend and his staff, who were taken to Constantinople. Later on it was General Townshend who was to have the honor of carrying the Turkish plea for an armistice in the closing days of the war. The surrender of Kut created a worldwide sensation. The loss of 8,000 troops was, of course, not a serious matter, and the road to India was still barred, but the moral effect was most unfortunate. That the great British nation, whose power had been so respected in the Orient, should now be forced to yield was a great blow to its prestige. In England, of course, there was a flood of criticism. It was very plain that a mistake had been made. A commission was appointed to inquire into the whole business. The committee reported to Parliament on June 26, 1917, and the report created a great sensation. The substance of the report was that while the expedition was justifiable from a political point of view, it was undertaken with insufficient forces and inadequate preparation, and it sharply criticized those that were responsible. It seems plain that the military authorities in India underestimated their opponent. The report especially criticized General Sir John Eccles-Nixon, the former commander of the British forces in Mesopotamia, who had urged the expedition in spite of the objection of General Townshend. Others sharing in the blame were the Viceroy of India, Baron Hardinge, General Sir Beauchamp Duff, Commander-in-Chief of British forces in India, and in England, Major General Sir Edmund Barrow, Military Secretary of the Indian Office, J. Austen Chamberlain, Secretary for India, and the War Committee of the Cabinet. According to the report, besides the losses incurred by the surrender, more than 23,000 men were lost in the relieving expedition. The general armament and equipment were declared to be not only insufficient, but not up to the standard. In consequence of this report, Mr. Chamberlain resigned as Secretary for India. In the House of Commons, Mr. Balfour, Secretary of Foreign Affairs, supported Lord Hardinge, who, at the time of the report, was Under Secretary of Foreign Affairs. He declared the criticism of Baron Hardinge to be grossly unjust. After some discussion, the House of Commons supported Mr. Balfour's refusal to accept Baron Hardinge's resignation by a vote of 176 to 81. It seems to be agreed that the civil administration of India were not responsible for the blunders of the expedition. 10 years before, Lord Kitchener, after a bitter controversy with Lord Curzon, had made the military side of the Indian government free of all civilian criticism and control. The blunders here were military blunders. The English, of course, were not satisfied to leave the situation in such a condition, and at once began their plans for a new attempt to capture Baghdad. The summer campaign, however, was uneventful, though on May 18th a band of Cossacks from the Russian army in Persia joined the British camp. A few days afterwards, the British army went up the Tigris and captured the Dujailah redoubt, where they had been so badly defeated on the 8th of March. They then approached close to Kut, but the weather was unsuitable, and there was now no object in capturing the city. In August, Sir Percy Lake was succeeded by Lieutenant General Sir Frederick Stanley Maude, who carefully and thoroughly proceeded to prepare for an expedition which should capture Baghdad. A description from General Maude, dated July 10, 1917, gives a full account of this expedition. It was thoroughly successful. This time, with a sufficient army and a thorough equipment, the British found no difficulties, and on February 26th they captured Kut el Amara, not after a hard-fought battle, but as the result of a successful series of small engagements. The Turks kept up a steady resistance, but the British blood was up. They were remembering General Townshend's surrender, and the Turks were driven before them in great confusion. The capture of Kut, however, was not an object in itself, and the British pushed steadily up on the Tigris. The Turks occasionally made a stand, but without effect. On the 28th of February, the English had arrived at Azai, halfway to Baghdad, where a halt was made. On the 5th of March the advance was renewed. The Ctesiphon position, which had defied General Townshend, was found to be strongly entrenched, but empty. On March 7th the enemy made a stand on the river Diyala, which enters the Tigris 8 miles below Baghdad. Some lively fighting followed, the enemy resisting 4 attempts to cross the Diyala. However, on March 10th the British forces crossed, and were now close to Baghdad. The enemy suddenly retired, and the British troops found that their main opponent was a dust storm. The enemy retired beyond Baghdad, and on March 11th the city was occupied by the British. The fall of Baghdad was an important event. It cheered the Allies, and proved, especially to the Oriental world, the power of the British army. Those who originally planned its capture had been right, but those who were to carry out the plan had not done their duty. Under General Maude it was a comparatively simple operation, though full of admirable details, and it produced all the good effects expected. The British, of course, did not stop at Baghdad. The city itself is not of strategic importance. The surrounding towns were occupied and an endeavor was made to conciliate the inhabitants. The real object of the expedition was attained. End of chapter 24.